In the previous video, we looked at how the word holy is used in the Old and New Testaments, noting that the Old Testament tends to use holy more in the sense of set apart, while the New Testament tends to use it more in the sense of moral perfection, as we do in modern English. And we looked at some reasons why one definition might be preferred. But now a simple question: why not both? Set apart and morally pure seem like such different concepts. How could they use one word for both? Here I'm going to try to explain the connection between these two concepts, which seems so different to us. However, getting this part right is not an easy thing to do. Often there is a kind of mental image which the word is meant to encapsulate, and such situations can vary in innumerable ways. So I may overlook something obvious or get this completely wrong or only partially right. I want to start by reading some passages you probably aren't expecting. The clean and unclean animals passages. They are repeated several places throughout the Torah, and I'm stitching together several parts which make the same point. As I read these, think about all the different kinds of animals it describes. Allow your mind to wander and just enjoy it. Do not eat any detestable thing. These are the animals you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews the cud. However, of those that chew the cud or that have a divided hoof, you may not eat the camel, the rabbit, or the hyrax. Although they chew the cud, they do not have a divided hoof. They are ceremonially unclean for you. The pig is also unclean. Although it has a divided hoof, it does not chew the cud. You are not to eat their meat or touch their carcasses. Out of all the creatures living in the water, you may eat any that has fins and scales. But anything that does not have fins and scales you may not eat. For you it is unclean. You may eat any clean bird, but these you may not eat: the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, the black kite, any kind of falcon, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the cormorant, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. All flying insects are unclean to you. Do not eat them. But any winged creature that is clean you may eat. Do not eat anything you find already dead. You may give it to the foreigner residing in any of your towns, and they may eat it, or you may sell it to any other foreigner. But you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Every creature that moves along the ground is to be regarded as unclean. It is not to be eaten. You are not to eat any creature that moves along the ground, whether it moves on its belly, or walks on all fours, or on many feet. It is unclean. Do not defile yourselves by any of these creatures. Do not make yourselves unclean by means of them, or be made unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves along the ground. I am the Lord, who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore, be holy, because I am holy. These are the regulations concerning animals, birds, every living thing that moves about in the water, and every creature that moves along the ground. You must distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. I am the Lord your God, who has set you apart from the nations. You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals, and between unclean and clean birds. Do not defile yourselves by any animal or bird or anything that moves along the ground, those that I have set apart as unclean for you. You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. Let's face it, the unclean animals are disgusting. Vultures and bugs and pigs and others that aren't mentioned by name, like eels and snails and possums. And that is what the Deuteronomy passage says in verse 3. These are detestable things. The passages go on to say that these abominations will defile anyone who eats them, and that this defiling will somehow disrupt the person's holiness. This is an indication that something more than set apart is at play. If I set apart some raw meat on the countertop and it begins to become defiled, it isn't any less set apart, but of course it is less pure. So in this example, the people are called to be set apart from the disgusting creatures which defile, so that they may remain pure. Purity is the goal, and set apart is the vehicle. Now, this example of contrasting majestic and vile creatures was a very real command about what not to eat. But it was about much more than that. This colorful picture was a symbol for moral defilement. That when we commit disgusting acts, that this will make us impure, and that we should live a lifestyle where we are separated from or avoid such things. The ancient people knew that such creatures existed out there in the world, but they were taught not to treat them in the same way they treat everything else they encounter. Most of us are just going about our daily lives, minding our own business, trying to pay the bills or keep the kids alive, or trying to have some fun, and we encounter all kinds of different things of the world. Some are benign and even nice. Others are vile and entice. It is incredible what we are exposed to nowadays when we're just scrolling social media or even just walking around town. It is so easy for us to think that this is just normal, even those of us who know better. But we have been taught that just because it exists doesn't mean it is good. Just because everyone is doing it doesn't mean that we should. Just because it is legal doesn't make it moral. And that we should separate ourselves from the unclean things of the world. One of the things I think about sometimes is how behavior which was unthinkable in my grandparents' generation became normal and accepted in my parents' generation, and how things which were scandalous in my parents' generation are expected now. But we know that at least some of these things are just plain wrong, and we can prove it logically. But all of that rationality counts for nothing in the lives of those without Christ. They are too pressured by the culture to do what is right. To be sure, you can say that there are Christians who do many of the same things, and you would be right. But what is really surprising is the extent to which good children with decent parents who were brought up with strong values cannot resist the moral decay of society without Christ. The reason that the metaphor of unclean animals works so well is because of the strong ick or disgust response that we humans can get from seeing certain creatures. This serves as an analogy for the way God feels and how we should all feel when encountering evil. And this is part of the purpose of the new heart of flesh which God gives us, to allow us to see things as they really are and be disgusted with what is truly disgusting. In our modern context, these passages have spawned infinite confusion and, in some cases, even attacks against God in the Bible. And I think that some of the power of this lesson has been lost because we are so separated from what we eat and everything is so processed. But farmers, and certainly ancient people, would have known what they were eating. So they had a real and visceral understanding of the physical, concrete side of the metaphor, but may have struggled extrapolating that to the moral side. Whereas we, in the modern context, understand abstract, moral ideas of bad things being dirty, but have trouble relating that to unclean animals. So, if the word holy can be used both for set apart and morally pure, then why is it that the Old Testament typically uses it as set apart and the New Testament uses it as morally pure? Perhaps it is because the Old Testament was focused more on the letter of the law, the application of the law, and the symbol itself, while the New Testament is more focused on the spirit of the law, the purpose of the law, and the meaning the symbol represents. In the previous video, we asked the question, if holy means set apart, then what does it mean to say God is holy? At the time, it was unclear, but now I think we can say that it means something like keeps himself separated from the unclean things and is not defiled by them. And this does point toward the moral perfection definition. I think this is straightforward enough, but if you do have some doubts, consider the context of Leviticus 11:44-45, Leviticus 19:2, and Matthew 5:48. Another possibility. Part of the original confusion was about, if holy means devoted, who is God devoted to? Perhaps God is devoted to abstract principles that are outside himself. Things like justice and love. And anyone who is entirely devoted to such principles would be morally pure as a matter of necessity. We have learned so much about what it means to be holy. In wrapping up here, I want to mention a few implications of this. One common theme is that the holy should be revered. We see again and again that the holy should be treated as something that is sacred. We must keep them safe from anything which may defile them, but also hold them in reverence in our thoughts because of how they are. As I mentioned several times, holy is in a lot of verses in the Bible, and some of those are major, memorable verses that we are all familiar with. Some of this discussion has the potential to shift our thinking about these verses, what they mean, and which senses are intended. Do any of these major verses stick out to you as meaning something different now? In addition to all this, there is an entire subsection of theology dedicated to holiness. Right next to doctrines of soteriology and divine aseity, you have doctrines of sanctification. And what it means for us to be made holy clearly depends on our definition of what holiness is. Although there are still unsettled questions to explore, I hope this video series helped explain the concept of holiness in the Bible, that the Hebrew word kadosh most literally means set apart, and it is often used in that way, especially in the Old Testament, but that it also carries with it the idea of being undefiled, morally pure. So, next time you hear a pastor say that holy actually means set apart, you will be one step ahead. Or maybe two.